Ethan Palmer sat alone in his meticulously organized home office, the soft hum of his computer the only sound breaking the silence. The walls were lined with awards, certificates, and photos that chronicled a life of achievement and discipline. Yet, despite the outward signs of success, the room felt cold, almost sterile, devoid of any warmth or personal touch. It had been 3 years since his wife, Emily, had passed away, and in those 3 years, Ethan had built his life around a rigid routine to keep the grief at bay. Every morning, he woke up at 5:30 a.m., went for a run, and then immersed himself in work, allowing the day's tasks to consume him until he was too exhausted to think. But today was different. A nagging unease had settled in his chest, a restlessness that he couldn't quite shake. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo of Emily on his desk. Her smile, frozen in time, was a painful reminder of what he had lost. She had been his anchor, the one person who had understood his drive and shared his dreams. Without her, the world had lost its color, and Ethan had retreated into a life of solitude, where control was his only comfort. The ringing of his phone broke through his thoughts, jolting him back to the present. It was a number he didn't recognize, and for a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. But something compelled him to answer. "Hello." Ethan's voice was clipped, as if the intrusion was unwelcome. "Mr. Palmer?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but urgent. "This is Sarah Mitchell from Beacon Hill. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." As the woman spoke, Ethan's heart sank. His sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, had passed away suddenly. The details were vague, an accident, a fatal one. But what struck him harder was the realization that his niece, Ava, now had no one. His sister's last wish had been for Ethan to take care of her daughter. The rest of the conversation blurred into a haze of logistics and arrangements. Ethan's mind was racing, grappling with the sudden upheaval of his carefully controlled life. Beacon Hill was a place he had left behind long ago, a small town filled with memories he had buried deep. And now, he was being pulled back into that world, forced to confront not only the loss of his sister, but also the responsibility of raising a child he barely knew. As he hung up the phone, Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The safe, controlled life he had built was crumbling around him, and for the first time in years, he felt utterly lost. He stared out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across his yard. The echoes of the past were calling him back to Beacon Hill, a place where his carefully constructed defenses would be tested in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But there was no time to dwell on what-ifs. He had to pack, to prepare for the journey back to a life he thought he had left behind forever. And as he stood in his quiet, orderly home, Ethan realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan drove through the winding roads leading to Beacon Hill, the small town he had once called home. The scenery was a stark contrast to the bustling city he had grown accustomed to. Here, the trees were tall and thick, their branches interlacing above the road, casting dappled shadows on the pavement. The air felt different too, cleaner, crisper, almost as if it carried the weight of memories long forgotten. He hadn't been back in years, and as the familiar landmarks came into view, a wave of nostalgia mixed with unease washed over him. The town hadn't changed much. The same old diner on Main Street, the same rows of quaint houses, the same community center where he used to play basketball as a kid. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, almost like a picture from a storybook he had outgrown. But one thing was different. There was a heaviness in his chest, a sense of dread as he approached the house that once belonged to his sister. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, nestled between 2 large oak trees. It was modest, with a white picket fence and a small garden that had seen better days. As he pulled into the driveway, Ethan noticed how worn the place looked. The paint was peeling, and the porch steps sagged slightly. It was a far cry from the immaculate home he had maintained in the city, but it was where his sister had lived, where Ava had grown up. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor him to something solid. But there was no escaping the reality that awaited him inside. With a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked up to the front door. The key Sarah had sent him felt heavy in his hand as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes from an absence that's too recent to be fully realized. The living room was small and cluttered, filled with remnants of a life that had been interrupted too soon. Photos of his sister and Ava lined the walls. Ava as a baby, Ava on her first day of school, Ava and her mother smiling together. It was a life Ethan knew nothing about, a life that had unfolded without him. He walked slowly through the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The kitchen table was still set for two, and in the sink, dishes were left unwashed, as if his sister had planned to clean them later. But later had never come. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, a mixture of guilt and sorrow for all the time he had lost, for the relationship with his sister that had faded into distant phone calls and obligatory holiday cards. He found Ava in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed, a stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. She looked so small, so fragile in that moment, and when she glanced up at him with tear-filled eyes, Ethan felt his heart break. This was no longer the confident, determined man who had faced countless challenges in his life. This was an uncle who had no idea how to comfort a grieving child. "Hi, Ava," he said softly, unsure of how to begin. It's Uncle Ethan." Ava didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with confusion and sadness. Finally, she whispered, "Where's Mommy?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. How could he explain something so incomprehensible to someone so young? He knelt down in front of her, trying to find the right words. "Mommy's not here anymore, Ava. She's gone to a better place." Ava's eyes welled up with tears, and she shook her head. "But I want her to come back." "I know, sweetheart," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you do. I wish she could too. But she would want you to be strong. And I'm here now. I'm going to take care of you, okay?" Ava looked at him, her small face contorted with grief, and for a moment, Ethan wasn't sure if she would accept him. But then she nodded, her tiny hand reaching out to grasp his. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the most important thing in the world. Ethan stayed with her in that room for a long time, just holding her hand, letting her cry when she needed to. There were no words that could make this right, no way to fill the void left by his sister's absence. But there was a silent understanding between them, a shared loss that connected them in a way Ethan had never expected. Eventually, Ava fell asleep, her head resting on his shoulder. Ethan carefully lifted her onto the bed, tucking her in and placing the stuffed bear beside her. He watched her for a moment, her breathing steady and peaceful, and he felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. This was his niece, his sister's child, and now she was his to protect. As he left the room, Ethan knew that the road ahead would be difficult. He had no idea how to be a parent, let alone a single one, but he was determined to try. For Ava, for his sister, and maybe even for himself. He closed the door quietly behind him, letting the darkness of the house envelop him as he made his way back to the living room. Sitting on the worn couch, Ethan felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The loss, the fear, the uncertainty of what the future held. But as he glanced at the photos on the wall, he knew he couldn't turn back now. Beacon Hill was his past, but it was also his future. And somehow, he had to find a way to make peace with both. The next morning, Ethan woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window, a far cry from the city noise he was used to. For a moment, he didn't recognize where he was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. He was in Beacon Hill, in his sister's house, now his responsibility. He glanced over at the clock on the nightstand, 6 a.m. His internal alarm had woken him, as it always did. But today, there was no run, no routine to follow, just a heavy silence and the overwhelming reality of what lay ahead. Ethan pulled himself out of bed, his body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress. The house was still, the kind of stillness that only happens when a place is adjusting to the absence of its heart. He stepped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet, and made his way to the kitchen. The dishes from the previous day were still in the sink, and the remnants of a half-eaten meal sat on the counter, forgotten in the chaos. He set to work cleaning up, hoping the mundane task would steady his nerves. As he washed the dishes, he thought about Ava and what the day would bring. She had lost so much so suddenly, and he didn't know how to help her through it. He didn't even know if he was capable of doing it right. But there was no choice. He was all she had now. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Ava stood in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, her eyes still puffy from the night before. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and it tugged at Ethan's heart in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Did you sleep okay?" Ava nodded silently, her gaze dropping to the floor. She was clutching the stuffed bear he had tucked beside her the night before, holding onto it like a lifeline. Ethan dried his hands on a towel and crouched down to her level. "Are you hungry? I can make some breakfast." Ava shrugged, a small, indifferent gesture that made Ethan's chest ache. He wasn't used to this. He was used to fixing things, to finding solutions. But there was no fixing this. All he could do was try to make things a little easier for her. "How about pancakes?" he offered, remembering how much she used to love them when she was younger, back when he would visit during the holidays. Ava looked up at him, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. Ethan smiled, grateful for even the smallest response. "Great. Why don't you go wash up, and I'll get started." As Ava shuffled off to the bathroom, Ethan took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand. He hadn't made pancakes in years, but he figured it couldn't be too hard. He found the ingredients in the pantry and set to work, his movements methodical, almost mechanical. But his mind was elsewhere, racing with thoughts about what the future would look like, school, routines, the conversations he needed to have with her about what would happen next. By the time Ava returned, the kitchen was filled with the smell of pancakes sizzling on the griddle. Ethan plated a stack and set it on the table, along with syrup and a glass of milk. Ava climbed into her chair, and for a moment, there was a semblance of normalcy as they sat down to eat. "Do you like them?" Ethan asked after a few bites, watching her carefully. Ava nodded, but she didn't look up from her plate. She was eating, but it was clear her mind was somewhere else, lost in a world of confusion and sadness. "Is there anything you want to do today?" he asked, unsure of how to fill the hours. "We could go for a walk, or maybe you could show me around. I haven't been back here in a long time." Ava paused, her fork hovering over her plate. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do I have to go to school?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He hadn't even thought about school, about how she would reintegrate after everything that had happened. "Not today," he said gently. "You can stay home today. We'll figure out the rest later." She seemed relieved by his answer and returned to her pancakes, eating a little more slowly now, as if she was starting to feel slightly more at ease. Ethan watched her, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility settle over him. He had no idea what he was doing, but he was determined to do whatever it took to make her feel safe. After breakfast, Ethan cleared the table while Ava wandered back to her room, still holding onto the bear. He finished the dishes quickly and then stood in the middle of the kitchen, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't like his life in the city, where every moment was accounted for, every task planned and executed with precision. Here, there was nothing but uncertainty. He decided to check in with Sarah Mitchell, the school principal who had called him with the news about his sister. He needed to figure out the next steps, and maybe she could offer some guidance. He found her number in his phone and dialed, waiting as the line rang. "Hello, this is Sarah Mitchell." "Hi, Sarah. It's Ethan Palmer," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wanted to thank you for reaching out yesterday. I'm still trying to process everything, but I wanted to talk to you about what comes next, especially for Ava." "Of course, Ethan," Sarah replied, her tone warm and understanding. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you both. Why don't you come by the school later today? We can discuss Ava's situation and see how we can support her." "That would be great," Ethan agreed, feeling a small sense of relief that someone was willing to help. "Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate it." After hanging up, Ethan felt a little more grounded, as if having a plan for the day gave him some semblance of control. He found Ava in her room, sitting on the floor with a pile of toys scattered around her, though she wasn't really playing with them, just absent-mindedly moving pieces from one place to another. "Hey, Ava," Ethan said, kneeling down beside her. I talked to the lady from your school. She said we can go see her later today. Would you like that? Ava shrugged again, her response muted, but she didn't seem opposed to the idea. Ethan smiled, trying to encourage her. It'll be good. We can talk to her about what you want to do. And maybe after, we can stop by the park or get some ice cream. This time, Ava looked at him, her expression softening just a little. Okay, she said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan stood up and extended his hand to her. Come on, let's get ready. Ava slipped her small hand into his, and together, they walked out of the room. As they left the house, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one filled with challenges and uncertainties. But as he glanced down at Ava, he knew that they would face it together, one step at a time. Ethan and Ava arrived at the small brick schoolhouse just after noon. It was the same school Ethan had attended as a child, but it looked smaller now, worn by the passage of time. The playground was empty, save for a few stray leaves that danced across the asphalt in the autumn breeze. Ava clung to Ethan's hand as they walked up the steps, her grip tightening as they approached the front doors. Inside, the hallways were quiet, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps on the tiled floor. They passed bulletin boards decorated with children's artwork and announcements for upcoming events, a stark reminder of the life Ava had been a part of until now. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized how much had changed for her in such a short time. Sarah Mitchell was waiting for them in her office, a warm, inviting space filled with bookshelves and comfortable chairs. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a smile that immediately put Ethan at ease. She stood as they entered, extending a hand to him. Ethan, it's good to see you, she said, her voice gentle. And you must be Ava. I'm so glad you came. Ava gave a small nod, half hiding behind Ethan, her eyes wide with apprehension. Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly before they both took seats across from Sarah's desk. Thank you for meeting with us, Ethan began, still unsure of how to navigate this conversation. I wanted to talk about what's best for Ava right now. I know she's been through a lot, and I'm not sure how to help her adjust. Sarah nodded understandingly. This is a difficult time for both of you. We'll do everything we can to support Ava here at school. But the most important thing right now is giving her a sense of stability. Routine can be comforting for children, especially after such a major loss. Ethan glanced at Ava, who was staring down at her shoes, her expression distant. Do you want to come back to school, Ava? He asked softly. You don't have to decide right now, but if you want to, we can talk about when you'd feel ready. Ava hesitated, then looked up at Sarah, who smiled encouragingly. You can take your time, Ava. There's no rush. We'll be here whenever you're ready. Ethan appreciated Sarah's patience, but he could see that Ava was struggling with the decision. He didn't want to push her, but he also knew that she needed to start rebuilding her life, to find some semblance of normalcy. I think it might help, sweetheart, Ethan said gently. Being around your friends, doing things you used to enjoy. It could make things a little easier. Ava finally nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay. Sarah smiled. That's a good start. We can ease you back in maybe just a few hours a day to begin with. And if you ever feel overwhelmed, you can always come talk to me or take a break. Thank you, Sarah, Ethan said, feeling a small weight lift off his shoulders. I really appreciate everything you're doing. It's no trouble at all, Sarah replied warmly. Ava's a wonderful girl. We're all here to help her through this. They discussed a few more details, including Ava's schedule and what support services were available at the school. Ethan was grateful for Sarah's thoroughness and the way she spoke directly to Ava, making sure she felt included in every decision. After they finished, Sarah walked them to the front door. Take care of each other, she said as they stepped outside. And remember, you're not alone in this. Ethan nodded, her words resonating with him. Thank you, Sarah. We'll be in touch. As they walked back to the car, Ava seemed a little lighter, as if the prospect of returning to school had given her something to focus on. Ethan opened the passenger door for her, and she climbed in quietly, clutching her bear to her chest. On the drive back to the house, Ethan tried to think of something to say, but the right words eluded him. He wasn't sure how to reach Ava, how to pull her out of the shell she was retreating into. He had always been good at solving problems, but this was different. This was something he couldn't fix with logic or planning. When they arrived home, Ethan parked the car and turned to Ava. "Do you want to go to the park for a bit?" he asked, hoping some fresh air and a change of scenery might help. Ava considered it, then nodded slowly. "Okay." Ethan smiled, relieved that she was at least willing to try. "Let's go then." They walked to the park, which was just a few blocks from the house. It was a small, quiet place with a few swings and a slide, surrounded by tall trees that rustled softly in the breeze. There were a few other children playing, their laughter echoing in the air, but Ava seemed hesitant to join them. Ethan led her to a bench near the swings and sat down, giving her the space to decide what she wanted to do. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, watching the other kids. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to his own childhood, to the times he had spent in this very park, climbing the trees and playing tag with his friends. It felt like a lifetime ago. Ava finally spoke, her voice small. "Do you think Mommy can see us?" The question caught Ethan off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He looked at Ava, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and realized how much she needed reassurance. "I think she can," Ethan said softly. "And I think she's watching over you, making sure you're okay." Ava's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, accepting his answer. "I miss her. I miss her too," Ethan admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "But she loved you so much, Ava, and she would want you to be happy, to keep living your life and doing the things you love." Ava looked down at her bear, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. "I don't know how." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He wished he could take away her pain, but all he could do was be there for her, to help her find her way through it. "We'll figure it out together," he said gently. "One day at a time. You're not alone, Ava. I'm here for you, no matter what." Ava didn't say anything, but she leaned against him, resting her head on his arm. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as they watched the sun begin to set behind the trees. The park was starting to empty out, the other children heading home for dinner. But Ethan and Ava stayed a little longer, finding comfort in the quiet moment they shared. For the first time since his sister's death, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, like a flickering flame in the darkness, but it was there. He didn't know what the future would hold, but as long as they faced it together, he believed they could find their way. The days began to take on a quiet rhythm as Ethan and Ava settled into their new life together. Each morning, Ethan would wake early, make breakfast, and then drive Ava to school. The first few days were tough. Ava would cling to him, hesitant to let go, her eyes full of anxiety as they pulled into the school parking lot. But each day, she got a little braver, and by the end of the week, she was walking into the building on her own, though she would still look back to make sure Ethan was watching. In the afternoons, Ethan would pick her up, and they would spend the evenings together, sometimes in the park, other times at home, where they would eat dinner in front of the TV or play a quiet game. Ava's silence still weighed heavily on Ethan, but he could see small signs of improvement, moments when she would smile or ask him a question about his day. Those moments gave him hope, even as he grappled with his own doubts and fears. One evening, after dinner, they were sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels aimlessly. Ava had been unusually quiet all day, and Ethan could sense something was bothering her. He glanced at her, noticing the way she was curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "Ava, is something on your mind?" he asked gently, not wanting to push but needing to know. Ava hesitated, then slowly turned to look at him. "Do I have to stay here forever?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He had been so focused on making sure she was okay day by day that he hadn't considered how overwhelming the future must seem to her. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "You can stay here as long as you need to, Ava," he said softly. "This is your home now. But if there's something you're worried about, we can talk about it." Ava looked down at her hands, her fingers picking at the hem of her shirt. I don't want to forget Mommy," she whispered. "But it's getting harder to remember her voice, and I don't want to forget." Ethan's heart broke for her. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You're not going to forget her, Ava. She'll always be with you, in your heart and in your memories. And we can do things to help you remember, Look at photos, talk about her, anything you want. Ava looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Can we look at some pictures? I don't have many in my room. Of course, Ethan said, relieved that she was opening up. Let's go find some. They went to the small room that had been his sister's office. Ethan hadn't spent much time in there since he arrived. It felt too much like trespassing into a space that still belonged to her. But now, he opened the door and let Ava lead the way inside. The room was filled with his sister's things, books, files, little knickknacks she had collected over the years. On the desk was a framed photo of her and Ava, taken not long before the accident. Ava picked it up, tracing the outline of her mother's face with her finger. She was so pretty, Ava murmured, a hint of a smile on her lips. She was, Ethan agreed, his voice thick with emotion. And she loved you more than anything in the world. They spent the next hour going through photo albums that Ethan found in a box on a shelf. There were pictures of his sister from their childhood, snapshots of family vacations, holidays, and everyday moments that seemed so ordinary at the time, but now held immeasurable value. Ava soaked it all in, asking questions about the stories behind the pictures, about the people she didn't recognize. Ethan answered as best he could, filling in the gaps where his memory allowed. When they came across a photo of Ethan holding a much younger Ava in his arms, a rare visit from when he had come home for Christmas, Ava looked up at him, a mixture of curiosity and sadness in her eyes. "Why didn't you come visit more?" she asked, the innocence of her question piercing Ethan's heart. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt washing over him. He had always told himself that his work, his life in the city, was too demanding, that he didn't have time to come home more often. But now, looking at Ava, he realized how hollow those excuses were. "I should have," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I got caught up in my own life, in my work, but that doesn't mean I didn't love you or your mom. I made mistakes." Ava looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting his answer. "I'm glad you're here now," she said quietly. "So am I," Ethan replied, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "And I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." They continued looking through the photos until Ava grew tired. Ethan tucked her in a bed, placing the photo of her and her mother on the nightstand where she could see it. As he kissed her goodnight, Ava reached out and hugged him, something she hadn't done since he arrived. "Good night, Uncle Ethan," she whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness that made Ethan's heart swell. "Good night, Ava," he replied, his voice barely steady. He left the room and closed the door softly behind him, leaning against it for a moment to gather his thoughts. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. Ethan felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe he wasn't perfect, and maybe he was still figuring things out, but for the first time since he arrived in Beacon Hill, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ethan returned to the living room, the photo album still spread out on the coffee table. He sat down and flipped through the pages, each image a reminder of the family he had once taken for granted. But now, he was determined to be there for Ava, to give her the stability and love she needed, and to honor his sister's memory by being the kind of guardian she would have wanted. As the night grew darker, Ethan found himself lingering on one particular photo, a picture of him and his sister as children, sitting on the porch of their old house, laughing without a care in the world. He smiled softly, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. They had lost so much, but there was still hope, still the possibility of healing and rebuilding. And that was enough for now. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines and small milestones. Each morning, Ethan would wake Ava up for school, and though she still clung to her stuffed bear, there was a growing sense of comfort in their shared rituals. The once foreign task of packing lunches and checking homework had become part of Ethan's daily life, and he found himself embracing the role with a quiet determination. On Saturdays, they would visit the park or take a walk through town, sometimes stopping by the local diner for pancakes, Ava's favorite. The small-town life that had once felt so distant to Ethan now began to feel oddly comforting, like slipping into an old, well-worn coat. One Saturday morning, as they were finishing breakfast at the diner, Ethan noticed Ava watching a group of children playing outside. Her eyes followed their movements, a mix of longing and hesitation in her gaze. "Do you want to go play with them?" Ethan asked, setting his coffee cup down. Ava shook her head quickly, retreating into herself. "No, it's okay." Ethan frowned, sensing there was more to her reluctance. "You don't have to, but it might be fun. You used to love playing with other kids." Ava looked down at her plate, her shoulders slumping. "They might not want to play with me." Ethan's heart sank at the sadness in her voice. He had been so focused on keeping her safe and comfortable that he hadn't considered how much she might be struggling with the idea of fitting in, of making new friends. "Why would you think that?" he asked gently. "You're a wonderful girl, Ava. Anyone would be lucky to have you as a friend." Ava shrugged, but there was no conviction in her response. "They don't know me." "Then let's change that," Ethan suggested. "How about next time we go over and say hello together? I'll be right there with you." Ava considered it for a moment, then nodded slowly, though she still looked uncertain. "Maybe." Ethan smiled, knowing that was the most he could ask for right now. "Okay, maybe. But remember, you don't have to do anything you don't want to. We'll take it one step at a time." After breakfast, they left the diner and walked through town, taking the long way home. The streets were quiet, with only a few locals out and about. But the familiar sights brought a sense of peace to Ethan. He was starting to feel like this was where he belonged, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. As they passed the community center, Ethan noticed a flyer posted on the bulletin board outside. It advertised a fall festival happening next weekend, with games, food, and activities for kids. He paused, reading the details. "Hey, look at this," he said, pointing to the flyer. "There's a festival next weekend. Would you like to go?" Ava looked up at the flyer, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of festival?" "It looks like there will be games, crafts, maybe even some rides," Ethan explained. "And I bet there will be a lot of kids there. It could be fun." Ava bit her lip, thinking it over. "Will you come with me?" "Of course," Ethan said without hesitation. "We'll go together." Ava's face lit up with a small smile, the first genuine one Ethan had seen in a while. "Okay, that sounds fun." Ethan felt a surge of relief and happiness at her response. It was a small step, but it was progress. He made a mental note to clear his schedule for the day of the festival, determined to make it a special experience for her. The following week, Ethan continued to notice subtle changes in Ava. She seemed a little more engaged at school, a little more willing to talk about her day. Sarah Mitchell had mentioned that Ava was slowly opening up to her teachers and classmates, though she was still shy and reserved. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was something, and Ethan clung to that hope. When the day of the festival arrived, the air was crisp and cool, the first signs of autumn evident in the changing leaves and the smell of pumpkin spice wafting through the town. Ethan and Ava arrived at the community center just as the festival was getting started. The parking lot was filled with cars, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. Ava's eyes widened as she took in the sights. Colorful booths lined with games and prizes, children running around with painted faces, and the tantalizing aroma of cotton candy and popcorn in the air. She looked up at Ethan, her excitement mingled with a hint of nervousness. "Ready?" Ethan asked, offering his hand. Ava nodded and took his hand, squeezing it tightly as they made their way through the crowd. They played a few games, with Ava winning a small stuffed animal at the ring toss, and shared a funnel cake, laughing as powdered sugar covered their faces. After a while, Ava spotted a face-painting booth and tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Can I get my face painted?" "Absolutely," Ethan said, happy to see her enthusiasm. They waited in line, and when it was Ava's turn, she chose a design of a butterfly, the artist carefully painting colorful wings across her cheeks. When she looked in the mirror, she grinned, her eyes lighting up with delight. "Do you like it?" Ethan asked, his heart swelling at the sight of her happiness. "It's so pretty," Ava said, her voice filled with wonder. As they continued to explore the festival, they came across a group of kids from Ava's school playing a game of tug-of-war. Ava hesitated, watching them from a distance, her earlier excitement giving way to uncertainty. Ethan knelt down beside her, his voice gentle. "You can join them if you want. I'll be right here." Ava looked at him, then back at the kids, her expression conflicted. Finally, she nodded, taking a deep breath. Okay. Ethan smiled encouragingly. Go ahead. You've got this. Ava slowly approached the group, and Ethan watched as one of the girls recognized her from school and waved her over. Ava hesitated for a moment, then joined them on the rope, her grip tentative at first. But as the game began, she started to smile, pulling with all her might as the kids on her team cheered her on. Ethan stood back, his heart swelling with pride and relief as he watched Ava laugh and play with the other kids. For the first time since he had arrived in Beacon Hill, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they were both beginning to heal, one small step at a time. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the festival, Ava ran back to Ethan, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Did you see me, Uncle Ethan? We won. I saw. Ethan said, his smile wide. You were amazing. Ava beamed, the joy in her eyes contagious. Can we come back next year? Definitely, Ethan promised, knowing that this was just the beginning of many more happy memories to come. As they walked back to the car, hand in hand, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude for this day, for the progress they had made, and for the bond that was growing between them. It wasn't easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt hopeful about the future. The days after the festival passed with a newfound ease between Ethan and Ava. The memory of her laughter at the festival lingered in his mind, a reminder of the progress they had made together. But as the weeks went by, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The daily routines had brought them closer, and Ava was slowly starting to find her footing again. But Ethan knew he couldn't do it all alone. He needed to reach out, to find more support, not just for Ava, but for himself as well. One evening, after Ava had gone to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He stared at his phone, scrolling through his contacts, stopping at the name of an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. The thought of calling him felt strange, almost foreign. But as much as Ethan had tried to be everything Ava needed, he was beginning to realize he couldn't keep doing it in isolation. Finally, he took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. Ethan, is that you? The voice was surprised, but not unfriendly. Hey, Mike, Ethan said, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over him. Yeah, it's me. It's been a while. No kidding, Mike replied, a hint of warmth in his tone. How are you, man? Last I heard, you were making waves in the big city. Ethan smiled faintly, though there was no pride in it. Yeah, well, things have changed. I'm back in Beacon Hill now. Beacon Hill? Mike sounded genuinely shocked. What brought you back? I thought you swore you'd never set foot there again. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. My sister passed away, he finally said, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. I'm here taking care of her daughter, Ava. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Mike spoke again, his voice softer now. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I had no idea. How are you holding up? I'm managing, Ethan said, though he knew it wasn't the full truth. But it's been tough. I've been trying to figure it all out, how to be there for her, how to do right by her. It's just a lot. Mike let out a sympathetic sigh. I can't imagine, man. That's a big responsibility. But you don't have to do it alone, you know? There are people here who want to help. I know, Ethan admitted, rubbing his eyes. But it's hard to ask. I've been so used to doing things on my own, I guess I forgot how to let people in. Well, it's time to change that, Mike said firmly. Beacon Hill may be small, but it's got a big heart. People here look out for each other. And I'd like to help, too, if you'll let me. Ethan felt a rush of gratitude, mixed with a twinge of guilt for having stayed away for so long. Thanks, Mike. I could use a friend right now. You've always had one, Ethan, Mike said, his voice sincere. Let's catch up soon. We can grab a beer, talk things over, and don't hesitate to call if you need anything. Will do, Ethan said, feeling a bit lighter as they said their goodbyes. As he hung up, Ethan realized that reaching out had been the right thing to do. The idea of reconnecting with old friends, of rebuilding the community he had left behind, no longer seemed as daunting. There was a comfort in knowing he wasn't as alone as he had felt. The next day, As Ethan was picking Ava up from school, he noticed Sarah Mitchell standing outside, talking to a group of parents. She waved when she saw him, excusing herself and walking over to where he stood. "Ethan, good to see you," she said with a smile. "How's Ava doing?" "She's doing well," Ethan replied, glancing at Ava as she chatted with one of her classmates. "I think the festival really helped. She's starting to open up more." "That's great to hear," Sarah said, her smile widening. "She's a wonderful kid. I'm glad to see her coming out of her shell." Ethan nodded, but there was something else on his mind, something he hadn't quite figured out how to address. "Sarah, I've been thinking, Ava's doing better, but I'm still worried. I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure I'm giving her everything she needs." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "It's normal to feel that way, Ethan. You've been through a lot, and you've taken on a huge responsibility. But you're doing a great job, and you don't have to do it alone." Ethan sighed, his frustration evident. "I know that, but it feels like there's so much to get right. I don't want to fail her." Sarah looked at him for a moment, then placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You won't, Ethan. The fact that you're so worried about doing right by her shows how much you care. And that's what she needs more than anything. Someone who cares, someone who's there for her. The rest will fall into place." Ethan nodded, feeling a little more reassured, but still unsure of himself. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that." "Anytime," she said, her voice full of warmth. "And remember, you can always come to me if you need help or just someone to talk to. We're all in this together." Ethan smiled, genuinely touched by her kindness. "I'll keep that in mind." As they said their goodbyes, Ethan felt a sense of calm settle over him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, and maybe there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. That evening, after Ava had gone to bed, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen. He began to jot down a list of things he wanted to work on, ways to support Ava, goals for the future, and a few names of people he wanted to reconnect with. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. As he sat there, the house quiet around him, Ethan felt a small but significant shift within himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was planning, moving forward, and that felt like progress. With a determined look in his eye, Ethan set the notepad aside and stood up, ready to take on whatever came next. The crisp autumn air had taken on a sharper chill as November settled over Beacon Hill. The trees, now almost bare, stood like sentinels along the quiet streets, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan and Ava had fallen into a steady routine, the days blending together as they navigated their new life. But the holidays loomed ahead, bringing with them a sense of unease that neither of them voiced. One evening, after dinner, Ethan noticed Ava sitting at the kitchen table, her homework untouched, a deep frown creasing her brow. She was holding a pencil, but she wasn't writing. Instead, she was staring off into space, lost in thought. "Ava," Ethan called softly, approaching the table. "Everything okay?" Ava looked up, her expression troubled. "Yeah, I was thinking about Thanksgiving." Ethan's heart sank a little. He knew the holidays would be difficult. This would be their first Thanksgiving without his sister. "What were you thinking about?" Ava sighed, fiddling with the eraser on her pencil. "Last year, we went to Grandma and Grandpa's house. Mommy made pumpkin pie, and we all watched movies together after dinner." Ethan nodded, the memory of past Thanksgivings tugging at his heart. "That sounds nice." Ava hesitated, her voice small. "It won't be the same this year, will it?" Ethan sat down beside her, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "No, it won't be exactly the same," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean it can't still be special. We can make new memories, just you and me." Ava looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "How?" Ethan thought for a moment, trying to come up with something that would bring a sense of comfort and familiarity to the day. "Well, we could cook together just like your mom used to. We can make the same dishes she did, turkey, mashed potatoes, and definitely pumpkin pie. And after dinner, we could watch some movies just like before." Ava's expression softened, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'd like that." Ethan smiled, relieved that she was open to the idea. "Great. We'll make it a special day, just for us." The week leading up to Thanksgiving was filled with preparations. Ethan took Ava grocery shopping, letting her pick out the ingredients for their dinner. She was excited to help, carefully choosing the best pumpkins and the ripest apples. It was a small thing, but it gave her a sense of purpose, a way to feel connected to the holiday. On Thanksgiving morning, they started cooking early. The kitchen quickly filled with the aromas of roasting turkey, simmering gravy, and baking pies. Ava was in charge of the pie, carefully following the recipe her mother had used. Ethan watched as she mixed the ingredients, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're doing great, Ava," he said, offering her an encouraging smile. "Your mom will be proud." Ava looked up at him, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I hope so." As the day went on, they worked together, side by side, preparing the feast. There was a quiet camaraderie between them, a sense of shared purpose that made the task feel less daunting. When the food was finally ready, they set the table with the best dishes they could find, lighting a few candles to add a warm glow to the room. As they sat down to eat, Ava paused, her eyes lingering on the empty chair that had once been her mother's. Ethan noticed and reached across the table to take her hand. "Would you like to say something before we start?" he asked gently. Ava nodded, squeezing his hand. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. I miss Mommy, and I'm thankful that you're here, Uncle Ethan. I'm glad we're together." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I miss her too, Ava, but I'm so grateful to have you in my life. And I promise, no matter what, we'll get through this together." They shared a quiet moment of reflection before beginning their meal. The food, though simple, was a labor of love, and it tasted better than anything Ethan had eaten in a long time. Ava seemed to relax as they ate, the familiar flavors and the act of sharing a meal bringing a sense of comfort and peace. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Ethan had set up a small TV and a stack of DVDs. "What do you want to watch?" he asked, handing Ava the remote. Ava scanned the titles, her eyes lighting up when she found an old holiday movie she used to watch with her mother. "Can we watch this one?" "Absolutely," Ethan said, settling onto the couch beside her. As the movie played, Ava snuggled up next to Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in months, she seemed truly content, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them like a blanket. Ethan put his arm around her, feeling the tension in his own body begin to ease. The movie ended, but neither of them moved, both content to sit in the quiet comfort of the moment. The candles on the dining table had burned down to their stubs, casting a soft, flickering light across the room. "Thank you for today, Uncle Ethan," Ava whispered, her voice heavy with sleep. "Thank you for being here with me," Ethan replied, his heart full. "I'm really glad we could do this together." Ava yawned, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Ethan stayed there for a long time, holding her close, the weight of the day settling over him like a warm blanket. It wasn't the Thanksgiving they had been used to, but in its own way, it was perfect. As he carried Ava to bed, tucking her in and brushing a stray hair from her face, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like they were finding their way. Together, they were creating new traditions, new memories, and in doing so, they were healing one day, one moment at a time. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Ava sleep, a soft smile on his lips. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more days when the weight of their loss would feel too heavy to bear. But he also knew that they had something stronger: love, resilience, and the unspoken bond that tied them together. As he turned off the light and closed the door, Ethan felt a quiet resolve settle in his heart. They would face whatever came next side by side, and they would find their way through the darkness. Because in the end, they were family, and that was something worth fighting for. December arrived in Beacon Hill, bringing with it the first dusting of snow. The town transformed into a winter wonderland, the rooftops covered in a blanket of white, the streets lined with twinkling lights. Christmas was just around the corner, and Ethan could feel the excitement building in the air. But with it came a quiet tension, a reminder that this would be Ava's first Christmas without her mother. Ethan tried to keep things as normal as possible, but he knew it wasn't the same. The holiday season had always been a time of joy for their family, a time filled with traditions and laughter. Now, there was a void where his sister used to be, and Ethan could see the sadness lingering in Ava's eyes, even as she tried to put on a brave face. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the tree glowing softly in the corner, Ava turned to Ethan, her voice hesitant. "Uncle Ethan, do you think we could do something special for Christmas? Something Mommy would have liked?" Ethan looked at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "Of course, Ava. What did you have in mind?" Ava thought for a moment, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Mommy always loved decorating the tree together. We'd listen to Christmas music and drink hot chocolate. And on Christmas Eve, we'd make cookies for Santa." Ethan smiled, remembering those Christmases with a pang of nostalgia. "We can definitely do that. How about we make it a new tradition? Just you and me." Ava's face brightened, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'd like that." The days leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations. Ethan and Ava spent a snowy afternoon picking out a tree at the local lot, choosing the tallest one they could find. They brought it home and spent hours decorating it with ornaments, some new, some old, that had belonged to Ava's mother. Ethan put on the Christmas music his sister used to love, and they sang along together as they worked, their voices filling the house with a warmth that had been missing for so long. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sipping hot chocolate, the tree lights casting a soft glow across the room. Ava seemed more at ease, her laughter more frequent, and Ethan found himself relaxing as well. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something new, something that belonged to them. On Christmas Eve, they made cookies together, rolling out the dough and cutting it into festive shapes. Ava was in charge of decorating, carefully placing sprinkles and icing on each cookie with a precision that made Ethan smile. As they worked, Ava talked about her mother, sharing stories and memories that made Ethan's heart swell with pride and sadness. "Mommy always let me stay up late on Christmas Eve," Ava said, her voice soft. "We'd sit by the tree and talk about what we were thankful for. I miss that." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I miss that too, Ava, but we can still do that if you'd like." Ava nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'd like that a lot." That night, after the cookies were baked and set out for Santa, Ethan and Ava sat by the tree, the fire crackling softly beside them. The house was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the Christmas music playing in the background. Ava snuggled up next to Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder. "What are you thankful for, Uncle Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked down at her, his heart full. "I'm thankful for you, Ava, for being here with me, for being so strong and brave. And I'm thankful for the memories we have of your mom, and for the new ones we're making together." Ava looked up at him, her eyes wide and sincere. "I'm thankful for you too, and for this Christmas. It's different, but it feels good." Ethan smiled, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I'm glad, Ava. I know it's not the same, but we're doing our best, and that's all that matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights on the tree twinkle in the dim room. After a while, Ava's eyelids grew heavy, and she began to drift off to sleep, her small body relaxing against Ethan's side. He stayed there for a long time, holding her close, the warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the tree lights wrapping them in a cocoon of comfort. The emptiness he had felt for so long was still there, but it was lessened by the presence of this little girl who had become his whole world. They were healing together, and that was enough. On Christmas morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Ava's excited footsteps racing down the hall. He smiled, pulling himself out of bed and following her into the living room, where the tree stood tall and proud, the presents they had wrapped for each other nestled beneath its branches. Ava's face lit up as she tore into the wrapping paper, her eyes wide with delight as she uncovered each gift. Ethan watched her, his heart swelling with joy at the sight of her happiness. It wasn't the extravagant Christmases of the past, but it was filled with love, and that made it perfect. When all the presents had been opened, and the living room was a mess of wrapping paper and ribbons, Ava turned to Ethan, a soft smile on her face. "This was the best Christmas, Uncle Ethan." "Thank you." Ethan pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "Thank you, Ava. I couldn't have done it without you." As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and enjoying the quiet of the morning, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The holidays had always been a time of joy and togetherness, and while this year was different, it had brought them closer in a way he hadn't expected. They had created something new, something that belonged to just the two of them. And as they looked ahead to the new year, Ethan knew that they would continue to find their way, step by step, side by side. The road hadn't been easy, but they were stronger for it, and that gave him hope for whatever came next. The new year came with a fresh blanket of snow, covering Beacon Hill in a serene, white silence. As the holidays faded into memory, Ethan and Ava settled into the cold, quiet months of winter. Life in their small town had returned to its usual rhythm, and while the wounds of the past year hadn't fully healed, they had found a way to keep moving forward together. One Saturday morning, Ethan found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the snow fall gently outside the window. Ava was in the living room, playing with the new art set he had given her for Christmas. She had always loved to draw, and Ethan had noticed that it seemed to help her express the emotions she found difficult to put into words. "Uncle Ethan?" Ava's voice called from the other room. Ethan got up and walked into the living room, where Ava was sitting on the floor, surrounded by crayons and sketch pads. She looked up at him, holding out a drawing. "What do you think?" she asked, a hint of pride in her voice. Ethan took the drawing and studied it closely. It was a picture of the two of them, standing together in front of their house, with the sun shining brightly overhead. He noticed the attention to detail, his hair, her favorite shoes, the flowers they had planted in the yard. But what struck him most was the look of happiness on their faces. "It's beautiful, Ava," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're really talented, you know that?" Ava smiled shyly, pleased with his praise. "I like drawing. It helps me remember things." Ethan nodded, feeling a pang of emotion. "You should keep doing it. Maybe one day you'll be an artist." "Maybe," Ava said, her smile widening. "I was thinking, I want to draw more pictures of Mommy, so I don't forget what she looked like." Ethan felt his chest tighten at the thought of his sister, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "That's a great idea, Ava. And if you ever want to talk about her or share your memories, I'm always here." Ava looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I know, and I'm glad you're here, Uncle Ethan. I was scared at first when you came, but now I don't feel so scared anymore." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion, and he knelt down beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I was scared too, Ava, but we're doing this together, and I'm so proud of you." Ava wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, and Ethan held her close, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the bond they had built over the past few months. It hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days ahead, but in that moment, he knew they were stronger for having faced it all together. Later that day, as they were getting ready to head out for a walk, the phone rang. Ethan answered it, surprised to hear Mike's voice on the other end. "Hey, Ethan, just wanted to see how you're doing," Mike said, his tone casual but warm. "It's been a while since we caught up." Ethan smiled, leaning against the kitchen counter. "We're doing okay. Ava's been doing really well, actually. It's amazing how resilient kids can be." "I'm glad to hear that," Mike replied. "Listen, I was thinking, how about we get together soon? Maybe grab dinner, catch up properly, and you can bring Ava along. I'm sure she'd love to meet my kids." Ethan considered the offer, feeling a bit of hesitation at the thought of re-entering the social world he had once left behind. But then he thought of Ava and how much she had grown, how much they had both grown, and he realized it was time to start rebuilding that part of their lives too. "That sounds great, Mike," Ethan said, his decision firm. "I think Ava would really enjoy that. Let's make it happen." "Perfect. I'll set it up, and we'll see you soon," Mike said, the warmth in his voice evident. After they hung up, Ethan found Ava in the hallway, bundled up in her winter coat and boots, ready for their walk. "Who was on the phone?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "An old friend," Ethan said, helping her adjust her scarf. "He invited us to dinner with his family. Would you like to go?" Ava's eyes brightened at the prospect. I'd like that. It sounds fun. Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of anticipation for the future. Then it's a plan. They stepped outside into the crisp, cold air, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they made their way down the quiet street. The town was peaceful, the winter landscape beautiful in its stillness. As they walked, Ava reached for Ethan's hand, and he took it without hesitation, feeling the warmth of her small fingers in his. They wandered through the snow-covered park, the same park where they had spent so many afternoons in the past year, each step a reminder of how far they had come. The memories of loss and grief were still there, but they had been joined by something new: hope, resilience, and the promise of brighter days ahead. As they reached the edge of the park, where the trees opened up to reveal a view of the town below, Ava stopped and looked out at the scene, her breath visible in the cold air. "Uncle Ethan," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Yeah, I think we're going to be okay," Ava said, her words simple but filled with a quiet certainty. Ethan looked down at her, feeling a swell of pride and love for this brave little girl who had faced so much and come out stronger on the other side. "I think so too, Ava," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I think so too." They stood there for a while, watching the snow fall gently around them. The town below bathed in the soft glow of the winter afternoon. And in that moment, with the world quiet and still, Ethan knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had found their way through the darkness, and now they were ready to step into the light, hand in hand, with hope in their hearts. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.